English in the present day. As of the present, there are enormous range of Englishes. So probably before you would find it wrong grammar to say Englishes, but now this is acceptable because there are so many varieties of English, like American English, British English, Philippine English, Japanese English, African English, so on and so forth. However, in this discussion, we will not take up all the other kinds of Englishes. Instead, we'll be just focusing on British English as well as American English. Orthography or spelling. Modern English spelling has inherited a mixture of Anglo-Saxon, Norman French, classical orthographic conventions, and many of which were fixed with the invention of printing in the 15th century. I hope you have not forgotten about the Gutenberg printing press and the other printing press in uh, London and Britain, which tried to standardize spellings. And eventually, subsequent phonetic change has been considerable so that sound spelling correspondence are now poor. In fact, today in the English language, the letter does not automatically correspond to a certain sound. A is not just A. Sometimes you could, for example, you would say apple. It's like an American A. But you would say mama. It's like a rounded A. Sometimes you would also read it as A, as in hate, Hate. So there is now poor sound spelling correspondence. Or sometimes there is a rule that you make some certain letters silent. For example, you would write Knight. Instead of saying knight, you just say night, or say home, Home. You don't really pronounce the letter E there. You don't say homey, but rather home. So that's what I mean when I say sound and spelling correspondence are now poor. There are also some superficial American-British differences resulting from Webster's reform in the early 19th century, which include color, color with an O in American English, but for British English, it's OUR. Center, ER for American English, but RE for British English. Catalog, just OG in American English, but OGUE in British English. Realize with a Z or realize with an S. These are actually very apparent. You would encounter this when you write in Microsoft Word, depending on what variety of English you're using. So your Microsoft Word will try to correct your the way you spell words. Other differences are um, aluminum, but in British English there's an I, aluminium. Analyze with a Z, analyze with an S for British English, so on and so forth. More recent moves for spelling reform have failed for predictable reasons. So one for which is, for example, early learners. Majority of the adults are following the standard English, and then suddenly you would introduce a new variety of English to early learners. So it somehow would alienate them from the language. Let's now go to phonology or the sound system. So English is a moderately complex phonology, like compared to, let's say, Vietnamese, which is a very tonal language, or let's say Spanish. There are 24 consonant phonemes, and 16 of these form voice and voiceless pairs. So I will show you the table in a while. So syllable structure permits clusters of up to 3 consonants. For example, strengths. So this is a consonant cluster with 3 consonants. NG, and strengths. So that's 3 consonants. Next cluster of 4 can also occur post-vocalically in inflected forms. For example, glimpsed, M, P, S, and T. Glimpsed. So that's 4 consonants. And then L, M, and some N, and sometimes R can be syllabic. So they could actually be one syllable. For example, you could say ba'o. So you deleted the T, so it became ba'o. Bottom, bottom, button, butter. So now they became one syllable just for one sound. So this was the tables that I mentioned earlier. So there are 16 pairs of consonant, voice, and voiceless pairs. And these ones, M, N, and G, R, L, J, W, and H, do not have a voice and voiceless pair. So on top here, these are the um, voiceless sounds. So P, the voice sound is B. So these are voice and voiceless bilabial. F and V, F and V. So this is the thorn and this is the edge. T and D. So as you can see, there is so much vibration. So that's how you know if it's voiced. There is so much vibration in your mouth compared to voiceless. There is not much vibration in your mouth. So these are nasals, and ng. Okay, and then these are the glides and the affricates. So yi and w. So these are the approximants, the R and L, and this is like the fricative. Just let the H flow. Okay, and these are some different transcriptions of the vowels in American and British English. So this is how you transcribe it in American English, but for British English, it's like this. I with like a colon. For this one, there's this. They are the same. Sit and sit. And for it's like a curved letter E. Sat. But for them, they will write it as a small letter E. Then these are the rest of the transcription. So you can study that for your own. And anyway, this will be discussed in your Intro to Language class. Next, word stress is lexically determined. Usually you put the stress at the beginning syllable if it's noun or adjective, but if it's verb, you usually put it um, at the second or the last, towards the last part of the word. Example, promise, promote. Promote is a verb. I will promote you. Promise is a noun. Or for example, you would say project, that's a noun. Project is the verb. So stressing is lexically determined, and like many languages, English signals incompletion or uncertainty by rising tone movements. So in a sentence, if the tone is rising, there's a feeling of incompletion or uncertainty. If, for example, you ask questions, are you sure? Usually your tone would rise. And closure or certainty by falling tones. You are sure. So it's a falling tone. Pitch also contributes to the expression of emotional attitude. When you're happy, usually, or excited, usually your pitch would also go up. So the pitch contributes to the expression of emotional attitudes. When you're sad, usually your pitch is also low. Now let's go to the differences between American and British pronunciation. So for British pronunciation, they have a certain distinct open back vowel phoneme, and that is absent in American English. So it's a short rounded O. For example, in British English, they would say quote, stop, on, cough, often, orange. So it's just a short open back vowel. But in American English, they would pronounce this as caught. It's a more open vowel and it's less high. So caught, stop, on, cough, often, orange. So as you can see, it's more open in American English compared to stop, on, cough. So that's the British way of pronouncing it. American English, these words are pronounced either with a, as in father, calm, car, or awe, as in caught, storm, all. But in British English, um, we probably pronounce this as caught, storm, all, something like that. Next, standard Southern British English is non-rhotic. It's only pronounced before a vowel sound. For example, in British English, you could pronounce the R because most of the time their R is non-rhotic if it's in the towards the coda or the last part of the word. So usually they would not pronounce that unless it is before a vowel sound. For example, you would say bury. So you need to pronounce the R. You can't say bury. Even if you're British, you need to pronounce the R. Bury. In American English, however, R is pronounced in final and preconsonantal position. Preconsonantal position. For example, you would say car, father, or card. So it's very rhotic and clear in American English. So the disappearance of post-vocalic R, as in dear, father, in British English has generated new diphthongs in some environment. For example, dear, instead of saying, because they will now not pronounce the R, so instead of saying D, they would make it somewhat like a diphthong, dia. They would, it's as if they are inserting another vowel in it, dia or here. The American intervocalic tapped allophone T in words like writer does not occur in British English. So they do not use that tapped allophone, writer. So instead, they really pronounce the letter T, writer. The glide vowels exemplified in day no differ in quality. They're generally analyzed as monophthongs. In American English, these are the transcriptions, A and O. But in British transcription, they really make it clear that they are diphthongs. So there are two letters to represent A and O. So E-N-I and E-N-O. You will encounter these transcriptions when you study the introduction of the American English. So the vowel sounds exemplified in die, boy, and how are generally analyzed as phoneme sequence, but in American transcription, a sequence in American transcription, but for British transcription, they are diphthongs. For example, die, small letter D, and then the letter A, then the letter I. So that's how you transcribe the word die. So they really have like phoneme sequence there. But probably in British English, they would just use the letter D and a diphthong. Next, some words written with A plus consonant, for example, fast or after, so A and then S or A and F, have A in American, Northern British, and Northern British varieties. So they would pronounce that as fast, after. But in standard Southern British English, they would pronounce this as father, father, after. Are you after me? So something like that. So in Southern British English, but in American English and Northern British varieties. Some words where oo follows a dental or alveolar in American English have ew in British English. So in American English, they would pronounce this as duty, tune, new. But in British English, they would pronounce this as duty, tune, new. So it's as if there's a Y and a U. But for American English, it's just oo. Some words ending in ari, airy, or ori have one more syllable in American English. So this is what you call epenthesis. But in British English, they do not apply that. So for example, stationary. So in American English, it's as if they would insert a letter A. So they would read it as stationary. But in British English, they would just say stationary. No insertion of letter A. French borrowing tend to have end stress in American English but front stress in British English. So in British English, front stress. So they would pronounce this as pate, ballet. But in American English, they have N stress, so therefore they would pronounce this pate, ballet. So let's now go to the changes. So ongoing changes in pronunciation include the following. The use of unvoiced w. So in American English, the transcription for this is an inverted W. So it's like this. Voiceless W. Don't uh don't get confused with the letter M. This is supposed to be a inverted W or in words like where, when is becoming less common. So the use of the voiceless W is becoming less common in American English and died out in British English. Intrusive R as in Asia, Africa is on the increase in British English. The change from U to U after dentals and alveolars is continuing with words like suit, illuminate, enthusiastic, increasingly being pronounced in British English without letter A. So they are starting to try and sound like American English. Glottalization of medial and final T, P, and K is growing in British English. So, for example, letter T. Instead of saying it letter T in your teeth, dental, they would make it into a glottal. So, for example, in the Philippines, um, we have a glottal stop. For example, you say buhi. It there is actually a glottal stop. So that's an example of a glottal. So if it's at the last part, for example, the letter T, instead of making it like a dental, they would now make it a glottal. So for example, they would say the word carrot. Instead of saying carrot, they would say carrot. So let's now go to lexis or the words. English has enormous vocabulary. Exactly how large the question is that nobody's really clear how many words the English language has now. Well, over 600,000 items are already included in the Oxford English Dictionary. Speakers and writers can now frequently choose between down-to-earth forms. When we say down-to-earth forms, this is usually used, although not always. These are the what we also know as the older words, and they could also choose to use more formal and elevated alternatives. These are usually the later imports. So here are some examples. You could use try or attempt. So these are the down to earth forms. Or you could choose endeavor. So that's the elevated form. You could choose the word start, begin, or you could also choose the elevated form commence. So it's something like that. For more literary purposes, the possibilities can be almost daunting. So words describing the reflection and transmission of light, for instance, include shine, glitter, glisten, gleam, glow. So there are so many synonyms that you could use. Inflections make the language morphologically hospitable. So the use of the inflections, the affixes, these are actually very helpful to us today because it helps us express language even better. Because if you use affixations on certain words, they somehow bring different meaning to the word that you are probably trying to look for. And English continues to borrow freely these affixations from other words. So Algeo lists, as of the 20th century borrowings, we have 56 languages borrowed for the use of um, affixations and inflections, with by far the highest proportion is from French. So here's an example of an affixation: pro life, for life. Although English has new inflections, it has a good deal of derivational morphology, with well over 100 affixes in common use. Many of them are productive. So here are the affixes that we could use: on, counter, re, as, hood, ism, ship, or especially in case suffix to change their word class: n, pro, age, so on and so forth. Originally borrowed mainly from Greek and Latin, which are particularly productive in present-day word formation. So we also have borrowings from Greek and Latin, like the word auto, the prefix auto, echo, meaning earth, cyber, mono, as in one, so on and so forth. While the vast bulk of English vocabulary is common to American English and British English, there are a fair number of well-known differences. So, many words in common use differ in their reference. For example, truck, mat, pavement, ship. Very frequently, different words are used for the same concept. For example, um, elevator in American English, but lift in British English. Faucet in American English, tap in British English, and check in American English, bill. So, in British English. So, these are the same concept but using different words. Vocabulary relating to cars, very interestingly, are very evident between American English and British English. So in American English, they would call it hood, but bonnet in British English, trunk in American English, boot in British English, so on and so forth. So let's now go to morphology and syntax, so word formation as well as the syntax. So when you study syntax, of course, very important to learn about the word classes. So depending on what grammar you're using, sometimes they say there are seven only, sometimes there are eight. But for this particular reference that we're using, the writer is putting 10 word classes. I will not really go into deep discussion about this because I guess we're all familiar with this, and surely you will cover this in Introduction to the Study of Language. So just to mention some, okay, for example, we have the count and mass nouns. So in general, we have nouns, but they are just pinpointing count and mass nouns because we have certain rules for count and mass nouns. For example, in um, count nouns, something you can count. So to make it in a plural form, you just need to inflect it. So put a letter S. Example, boy, two boys. Clitics are preferable nouns with human references. Clitics are, for example, you put apostrophe S. That's a clitic, the apostrophe S there. It's like an attachment to a noun. So, um, for example, you say the boys bag. So the clitic there is apostrophe S. And usually it's more natural to use clitics if it's for human reference. You could actually use it to non-humans, but it would not sound that natural. So we also have determiners, the, a, and these are determiners, but in other grammar books, they would just combine determiners with adjectives. Pronouns, lexical verbs, primary auxiliary, modal auxiliary, adverbs, preposition and conjunctions, and inserts, or also known as interjections. In some grammar books, they would delete interjections. Let's now go to noun phrase structure. So nouns can be pre-modified by determiners, adjectives, and noun modifiers. So in that order. So for example, the noun is um, dog. So determiner, the, adjective, something to describe the dog. So the cute, the cute, noun modifier. Sometimes you could use noun to modify another noun. So for example, you would say um, German, the cute German dog, or let's say apple pie. Uh, the determiner is adjective is delicious, a delicious, noun is apple, noun modifier, and then the noun is pie. So a delicious apple pie. So it's pretty easy to analyze noun noun group. So now let's go to the verb group. So when we talk about verbs, you need to take into consideration the tense, the aspect, modality, mood, and voice. So English has a relatively rich and complex verbal system, especially in main clause use. English perfective, when you use has or have, that's the perfective aspect. It encodes anteriority, often with continuing relevance. So anteriority, it happens in the past. So for example, we couldn't get in because I had lost my key. So there's a feeling that it happened in the past because I had lost my key. But it has there's a feeling that there's a continuing relevance. So I had lost my key. That's why the continuing relevance is that we couldn't get in. I'm afraid Jane has had an accident. So has is the auxiliary verb or the modal has, and then had is the uh, main verb there, has had, and an accident. So there's a feeling that it happened in the past. Then there's a continuing relevance. Next is future events arising out of present situations are generally referred to by present forms. So if you will be using ing form plus infinitive, so we're meeting again tomorrow. So there's a feeling that this is a present situation. So that's why we need to use it in the present form. Look out, we are going. So this is the event now. But since you put ing, so there's a feeling that although it's happening in the present, it will continue to happen until in the future because the crash has not happened yet. So it's still about to happen. So we are going to crash. We're meeting again tomorrow. So they are meeting right now, but there will be a continuity by tomorrow. You will be paid at the end of the month. A realist modality is expressed principally by the use of modal auxiliaries or especially in subclauses by past tense. So what is a realist modality? So a realist modality is when you when there is wishful thinking, it could or it could not happen. Uh, yeah, there's a potential there for the event for the thing to happen. For example, and these are usually marked by modality, the use of modal auxiliaries. For example, here, it would. Would is the modal auxiliary, be better if you came tomorrow. So there is now a feeling that the person that this person is talking to could or could not go by the next day because there is a feeling it would be better. So there's a potential there. Could or it could not happen. She must have forgotten. So the auxiliary here is must. Okay, it's important that she be told. Okay, that's an American English, but it's more the modal auxiliary here should be should. It's important that she should be told. So there's a wishful thinking there, potential. So English is unusual in that oblique arguments can act as subjects of passive verbs. So oblique arguments are not direct arguments. Usually there's a preposition there and there's a feeling that there's a doer of the action but not really being mentioned. So there is somewhat an omission of a doer of the action. So oblique argument, the attachment supposedly for the preposition like to or on or something like that is not really object or subject or indirect object, subject, object, or indirect object of the sentence. For example, I've been given one of these forms. So there's a feeling that who gave those forms. So next is that she hates being shouted at. So there's a preposition here and there is really no mention of a doer of the action. She's being shouted at by who? So it's not mentioned. So that's why it's really an oblique argument. So That's why it can act as subject of a passive verb. So this is a passive form. Next, reflexive and middle relations can be indicated by pronouns. For example, oneself, hurt oneself. So there's a reflexivity there. Now let's go to clause and sentence structure. Canonical SVO order, because today we're using SVO order, subject, verb, object, is greatly observed in written English. And non-prepositional indirect object precede direct objects. For example, if you don't look at the indirect object here, we wish a happy new year. That's ungrammatical. So we wish you a happy new year. So the indirect object here, this is non-prepositional, so does not use to or on or below or around, something like that. So since it's non-prepositional, that's why it precedes the direct object. So that's a general rule in um, standard language of English. So verb and objects constitute a tight unit, so usually they go together. For example, we wish. So the subject and verb usually go together. Relative and interrogative pronouns and adverbs are initial in clauses. For example, who? Who ate the cake? So that's an example of an interrogative or relative pronoun. So usually they are in the initial part of the clauses. Um, who? What? 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 What destroyed the boat? So something like that. Interrogatives are formed by inversion of the subject and operator. Operator, it is usually the be verb, the is mr. For example, you would say, she is beautiful. The subject is she. Operator is. Then adjective is beautiful. So that it will become an interrogative or a question, you put the operator, which is into the initial position. So it now becomes, is she beautiful? Negation by adding not to the operator. So just put not after the operator. So for example, she is beautiful. So if you put not after is, so it is now a negation. So she is not beautiful. So you are negating the beauty of that person. So nominative and accusative case are marked positionally with redundant morphological marking in some pronouns. So you would know if it's nominative case because it's very apparent in the pronoun that you will use. For example, you would say he if it's in the nominative position, but if it's accusative, you would say him. He is a student, but you would use him if it's in accusative form. So I was tickled by him, something like that. So him is now in the accusative position. Verbs have wide range of possible complementation patterns. And next, coordination and subordination operate as in most um, international English languages. So you would know that it's just part of one sentence. You would know that it's coordinating because although this sentence is um, another sentence, but you would know that they are in one paragraph because they somehow coordinate with each other. And the sentence as unit is an essential feature of the written language. Of course, especially in the academic institutions, we need to write essays and all. So the vital components of these essays, term papers, research papers is the construction of sentences as a unit. English allows an unusual wide variety of participant roles to be encoded as active subjects, including the following: agent, patient, experiencer, so on and so forth. You will take that up in the study of the English language. Indirect and prepositional objects can become passive subjects. So the have passive enables experiencer to be encoded as a subject. Um, This is the had passive. Enables the experiencer to be encoded as a subject. So indirect and prepositional objects can become passive subjects. So this is a prepositional object in a storm. So somehow in a storm here becomes somewhat as an indirect object. So that's why there's a feeling that it is now the subject. It can now be encoded as the subject of the sentence. So English is also rich in lexical alternatives with different argument selections. So same words, same idea, but expressed using different words. Admire, impress, frighten, fear, notice, strike. So that's how rich the English lexicon is. So these are the apparent changes in the English language. I will not take them up one by one, maybe just point out some of them in the ongoing changes in the English language. For example, um, increased use of progressive with stative verb. So before, if you would use progressive, it's usually an action word, for example, walking. But now you could use it with stative verbs and it is increasingly used. Understand is an example of a stative verb, understand. But you can now add ing, so it now becomes like a progressive form. I am understanding German better now. Continued spread of the going to future. I'm going to the party. Replacement of shall by will and of should by would in some contexts. I shall go, I will go, so on and so forth. Increase of noun plus noun compounds. For example, rainbow. So disappearance of whom. People don't really usually use this now because it's somewhat really formal. So, for example, you would say the food was eaten by whom. So instead of saying that, which is very formal, you could actually just say who ate the food, something like that. There's also an increased use of preposition stranding. So preposition is stranded. For example, an object occurring somewhere other than immediately after the preposition. Example, stranding, I heard of. So you could actually supposedly, in the usual way, you could say this, I heard of stranding, but you stranding. That maybe sound confusing. I heard of, so this is the preposition. Supposedly, this is the noun that it needs to be attached to, but you place it somewhere else. That's why now off here has become stranded. Dropping of complementizer relative that. So people sometimes do not put that anymore. Yeah, probably for ease of use. The the food I like is cake. So you delete that. The food that I like is cake. So grammatical systems, these are some American British differences. So for example, he just went home, but in British English they say he just gone home. Do you have a problem? Have you got a problem? I've never really gotten to know her. I've never really got to know her. So these are some other differences as well. American English and British English. Standardization and prescriptivism. So standardization continues in the English-speaking world with regional dialects converging on standard varieties. And in fact, the written and spoken divide is narrowing because of, like, for example, electronic communications now. So how people speak is most of the time now when they use English is also how they would write in English. Also, a command of the orthographic, grammatical, and rhetorical conventions of the standard written language is commonly equated with superiority. So if it's more standard, correct spelling, more grammatical, it would somehow reflect superior intelligence and educational achievement. However, English is often perceived as being in a state of decay, threatened by variable changing usage, the encroachment of non-standard forms, a growing lack of respect for the time-honored rules, and the failures of school to provide adequate grammar teaching. The feeling that the language is in danger generates a belief that grammarians, lexicographers, publishing houses, the media, education community have to defend it. And despite the growing tolerance of regional pronunciation, elitist attitudes persist. In fact, there was a letter by the Sunday Times in March 1993 described speakers of estuary English as resembling the dregs of humanity. Particular regionalism are still widely prescribed or made fun of. So that's that's how people would really want that there is like a standard kind of English. So for the future of the English language, it continued takes on the role of a world lingua franca. In fact, we call it as the universal language, and it is certain to develop in interesting ways, especially with language contact with other countries. So one can imagine that a future international variety of English or group of varieties might detach itself somewhat from the American and British standards, and alternatively, it might pull them along with it. So that's the end of my discussion. This is the reference, and thank you for listening.